Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. As we recognize Black History Month, I am covering 4 individuals who were trailblazers for equality in the entertainment industry. I covered Bessie Smith last week, who had a remarkable and heartbreaking story. Please visit that episode if you haven't already listened to it. These stories are very important. Today, we will be talking about a jazz legend. He's known as Satchmo, Pops, and the ambassador of jazz. The one, the only, Louis Armstrong. Before I begin, let's talk about how we pronounce his name. Is it Louis or Louis? Well, it can be both. His proper name is Louis, and that's how he referred to himself, but he was also okay with people calling him Louis. So you may hear me refer to him by both versions, because Louis Armstrong is what I've always known him as. Louis Armstrong was born on August 4th, 1901, in about the most appropriate place a future jazz god could be born, New Orleans. But he was born in one of the worst neighborhoods in the city, so bad it was called the battlefield. Louis's parents were William and Mary, and he had a younger sister named Beatrice. She wasn't too much younger than him. William left his wife and children when Louis was just a toddler, leaving Mary to figure out how to support herself and her very small children on her own, which, of course, was a very difficult position for a Black woman to be in during the turn of the century in the South. Mary was young. She was only 17 or 18 when her husband left. She worked as a laundress, and since that wasn't enough to support the family, she was also forced to work as a sex worker. Luckily, Mary had her mother and other family members to lean on, so it took a village to raise Louis and Beatrice. Although New Orleans was rich with music and arts, it was also rich with racism and segregation. It was not an easy place to live for Black people, but this was sadly all Louis knew, having grown up like this. The family was poor, and Louis took on odd jobs as a child to help his mother out financially. He collected scrap and delivered coal. And while bustling around New Orleans doing his childhood jobs, Louis Armstrong discovered music. The streets of New Orleans in the first decade of the 20th century were vibrant with ragtime and blues music. There were street performers everywhere. The diversity of music was amazing to the young boy. The Armstrong neighborhood was a tough one, and the childhood built around poverty and hardship molded Louis into a strong and resilient kid. It's a really sad way to obtain these qualities, but they were traits he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The most impressive trait Louis Armstrong held, however, was optimism. Despite growing up through the abandonment of his father, extreme poverty, scarce food, segregation, and constant racism, Louis was known to be infectiously optimistic and able to find the positive in every single situation. I mean, you just think of him as an adult and you envision him wearing that huge, happy smile of his. And it was authentic. You know how you can tell if a smile is authentic or not. Well, Louis Armstrong's was a truly happy and blessed smile. When Louis was 11 years old on New Year's Eve that year, he got a little carried away during a street celebration when he fired a gun into the air. This stunt landed him in a reform school for Black boys called the Colored Waifs Home for Boys. The facility was not well equipped. Most of the kids were forced to sleep on the hard floor, meals were usually nothing more than bread and molasses, and punishments were severe. But you know what they had at the reform school? A brass band. This negative situation would end up being the gateway to Louis Armstrong's future. Not only was music encouraged at the reform school, but Louis was introduced for the first time in his life to structure and routine. As a preschool teacher, I've been a broken record for the last 19 years with the words structure and routine. These two things are the magic potion that will transform any child. that will redirect mistaken behaviors and nurture their mental health. I'm serious, it's pretty powerful. I mean, I need structure and routine in my life, but kids especially need it. They need it for their development and their ability to learn and thrive. And for a child who had never been able to have that kind of life, it was a very transformative experience. I'm not saying the punishments were acceptable at the reform school, not at all, but the structure is definitely something that Louis needed. I also really appreciate the understanding the school's band leader, a man named Peter Davis, had about the power of music in a child's emotional development. He guided his students through musical expression, which is a very powerful tool in supporting mental health and provides a great artistic outlet. It's really difficult for children to understand their emotions, and art and music expression are amazing outlets for this. And the instrument Louis Armstrong picked up at the Waifs' home was the cornet. And the moment he picked that instrument up, his life would be forever changed. The Reform School Band would perform regularly at various community events, and they were well regarded as a very talented group of budding musicians. And it was with the school band that Louis Armstrong first discovered the joy of performing for others and sharing the journey through music with audiences. And he loved it. He knew music could change lives. It had for him, and he wanted to share that magic with as many people as he could. Louis was at the reform school for 2 years, and what began as a severe punishment turned into a very positive experience for him. When he returned home at 13 years old, he was well-mannered, he had confidence, and he had a positive sense of self-worth. And he had a new talent. He was an exceptional musician. Louis's cornet was attached to him. It was like a new limb on his body. He became a street performer, just like the ones he would watch with amazement as a young child. And then he began performing in the unique New Orleans tradition of jazz funerals. As part of a jazz funeral, a brass band plays somber hymns as the body makes its way to the cemetery. And then after the body has been laid to rest, the music turns more upbeat as the mourners celebrate the life of the deceased. You can see this in our movie of the month this month, Imitation of Life, I believe in both versions. As put so perfectly in the book, Louis Armstrong, The Untold Story of Jazz's Beloved Ambassador by Celine Ashcroft, quote, "This duality of emotion, mourning, and celebration deeply influenced Louis's understanding of music's power to convey the full spectrum of human experience," end quote. I really love that funeral tradition. New Orleans really is about the best place you can be if you're an aspiring jazz musician. The music world there is just so rich. Louis Armstrong was performing on the streets as often as he could, whether it be by himself or together with other local musicians. That optimistic spirit of his saw each coin tossed into his hat as one more person that he affected through his music. One more life he enriched. The streets were also kind of a music school, too. The camaraderie of the local musicians led to them helping each other, teaching each other new techniques, new instruments, new lessons in music. The next step in Louis Armstrong's musical endeavors were local New Orleans dance halls, and he was able to work and learn from even more local musicians in these venues. He really loved seeing his audience's reactions to his music. His music was making people happy, and they were having so much fun dancing to his rhythms, and this was the fuel he needed to make himself even better. He wanted to be the best. Louis was still a teenager when he began performing in dance halls and social clubs, about 15 years old. Just a kid. Just think of the direction his life may have headed if he hadn't been sentenced to those 2 years in the reform school where music had been introduced to him. It was really one of those great blessings in an ugly disguise. In 1918, 17-year-old Louis Armstrong shifted his talents to yet another musical endeavor. He became a riverboat musician. He joined the band on a riverboat that traveled up and down the Mississippi River, and this would become his first steady gig as a musician. His boss, band leader Fate Maribel, was strict and disciplined and expected the very best from his musicians. This job provided more to Louis's musical skills because they played a wide variety of music, not just jazz and ragtime. It was also the first time Louis played for white audiences. This wasn't necessarily a negative experience. Optimistic as always, Louis looked past the racial inequalities and saw instead how music brought the races together. The magic of music blurred the racial lines between black and white. When there was music, color didn't seem to matter as much. Don't get me wrong, racism absolutely still existed on the riverboats. But Louis's optimism helped him focus on the good. But in reality, he was forced to sleep in very cramped quarters, he wasn't allowed to interact with the white passengers after his performances, and the pay was low. But he spun it in his own amazing positive way. In his mind, he was lucky to have a place to sleep, he interacted deeply with the white passengers while he was on stage, and the monetary pay may have been low, but the experience he was gaining was rich. Louis Armstrong was a riverboat musician for 3 years. After 3 years, he felt he was ready for more. But he did not want to reach for that a second before he knew he was ready for it. The same year 17-year-old Louis had begun working on the riverboat, he fell in love and got married. His new bride's name was Daisy Parker, a sex worker in New Orleans. Daisy really supported Louis's career, but she didn't really like the part of him being gone all the time, which is kind of what a musician needs to do. Louis and Daisy had a fiery relationship. They had a deep bond, but the disagreements heated things up quite a bit. They were just so young, too. Soon after they were married, Louis and Daisy took in the son of Louis's cousin who had passed away. The little boy was named Clarence, and he was 3 years old. Clarence's father was a white man from the neighborhood that was known for taking advantage of young black girls. And in Louis's cousin Flora's case, it resulted in a pregnancy and the birth of little Clarence, who the father, of course, wanted nothing to do with. So at 17 years old, Louis Armstrong was married and had an adopted 3-year-old child. Clarence sustained a serious head injury by falling off of a second-story deck at his new home with Louis and Daisy. The traumatic brain injury left him with permanent intellectual disabilities. Louis knew that he needed extra support in life now after his TBI, plus he experienced a lot of anxieties as a result of the brain damage, and Louis was very patient with him knowing that. He wanted to make sure Clarence had the best life he could possibly have. I think it's pretty noble for that time in history to be so compassionate and proactive about this kind of intellectual impairment. So when Louis's riverboat music stint ended in 1922 and he was about 20 years old, a letter from Chicago would signal the next stepping stone in his climb to the top. His mentor from the New Orleans street performance days was now one of the most respected band leaders in the Windy City, and he wanted Louis Armstrong to come on up and join his band, Joe King Oliver and his Creole Jazz Band. And in Chicago, Louis continued to put his all into building on his skills and becoming the best musician he could possibly be. The Creole Jazz Band performed in popular venues and had a devoted audience. But segregation and inequality were still a very present reality in the lives of Black performers in Chicago. However talented and popular Louis Armstrong was on stage, he was still met with unfair pay and the denial of entry into many establishments. In 1923, the band had some sessions in a recording studio, forever preserving their art. Louis had never heard himself play from an audience perspective, so when he was able to listen back to his music, he was able to critique his own work and make improvements where needed. He was really good, but remember, he wanted to be the best. Of course, we take this ability for granted today, being able to record ourselves or listen to music recordings, but we're talking about a time before audio and video recordings were so attainable. This was groundbreaking technology for Louis Armstrong. For the world. Because of these recordings, Creole jazz was reaching the ears of countless people who otherwise wouldn't hear it. It was good for business. Louis's career was looking good, but his marriage not so good. He and Daisy divorced shortly after his relocation to Chicago, but there was a fine and talented young woman in the band that was quite smitten with him. pianist Lil Hardin. Lil was smart, cultured, refined, and very talented. Like Daisy, she supported Louis's career, but she had different intentions in doing so. She encouraged him to work hard and put in the work to become the finest musician the world had seen. She knew he had the talent to step out of the ensemble world and onto the stage as a solo musician if he wanted. She believed in him. Lil and Louis got married in February of 1924. Louis was still so young, just 23 years old by this point. And Clarence was right there with them. Lil, by Louis's account, had a temper though, and sadly Clarence was at the receiving end of that temper much of the time. Lil continued to encourage him to reach greater professional heights, and in 1925 he felt ready to leave the Creole Jazz Band and expand his professional experience. He also made the shift to playing the trumpet. "Joe Oliver, you know how much I love Joe Oliver," Louis later said. But still in all, he did make a statement to Lil during a conversation. He said, "As long as little Louis is with me, he can't hurt me." When she told me that did it. And to me, she said, "It's all indications that King Oliver is trying to hold you back." I didn't say a mumbling word. I didn't say anything. I just split. That's all. Lil spoke, and that was it. And I don't regret it today. Louis Armstrong was spreading his wings even wider now. In 1929, he moved from Chicago to New York City. He did some solo work, and then he entered the big band scene and joined Louis Russell's orchestra, where he was the leading soloist. We all know Louis Armstrong sang too, right? That unforgettable, one-of-a-kind gravelly voice. It was this time of growth in New York where he really let his voice shine. He wanted his voice to be like his instrument. Before too long, Louis Armstrong was a huge celebrity. His celebrity was so big that in 1932, he achieved something he never would have imagined as a poor child growing up in the battlefield neighborhood of New Orleans. A European tour. This was an amazing accomplishment for the 31-year-old musician. And the Europeans loved him. How could they not? Unfortunately, his second marriage wasn't able to stand the test of time. Louis and Lil separated in 1931, but didn't officially divorce until 1938. The divorce finally took place because Louis was in love again. Louis had moved in with another woman right after he and Lil had separated, and he said "I do" for the third time in 1938 when he married that woman, a dancer named Alpha Smith. Clarence moved in with Alpha's mother when he and Lil had first separated in 1931, and she was his primary daily caregiver for most of the rest of his childhood. Louis would spend as much time as he could with Clarence, though, and always made sure they had high-quality time together. Louis was Clarence's favorite person in the whole world, and Louis loved Clarence so much, too. History seemed to repeat itself with Louis's marriage to Alpha. He definitely had a type. Like his first two wives, Alpha was just what her name says, Alpha. She was strong-willed and assertive, and this, like the others, would eventually clash with Louis's extremely down-to-earth, calm nature. And they were both cheating on each other almost immediately. The marriage only lasted 4 years. Swing was becoming all the rage in the early 1930s, and Louis Armstrong was eager to flow right along with the changing landscape of music and move right along with the hottest music trends. He loved what he did, and he had a great time doing it, no matter what style of music it was. He just wanted to play. Not only did he make powerful music, but his entire presence was powerful to his audiences. He had such an infectious energy to him. He was just so charismatic and fun. He clearly loved what he did. And that smile, his smile was so amazing. And even with his smile covered by his trumpet, you could still see his smile through his eyes when he played. Gotta love that signature Louis Armstrong eye roll, too. When radio was soaring into popularity in the 1930s, it only meant more fame for Louis as more ears were able to hear his music. Of course, nothing could compare to his live performances, but the whole world was able to discover the talent of Louis Armstrong now through radio waves. He also formed Louis Armstrong and his orchestra, which toured all over the world. And the young musicians who joined his tours, he became a valuable role model to them all. He took the time to work with them, teach them, and guide them. He was their mentor. He had been where they were, and he had once wanted to go where they wanted to go. Have those big dreams that they were dreaming. He wasn't too big or too busy to help the young budding musicians. How cool is that? Louis Armstrong was a huge celebrity, but he was still a black man living in the Jim Crow era. Even though he was extremely famous, talented, and successful, he was still banned from many hotels, restaurants, and venues, especially in the South. If Louis was performing at a whites-only venue that did welcome in his talent, his family or friends who accompanied him would often not be allowed to enter the venue or would have to wait for him in a different part of the building. He would try his infectious Louis Armstrong charm and warm demeanor to soften club managers so they would allow him and his band equal treatment. On one occasion at a venue in Mississippi, Louis flat out refused to perform unless his band and crew received equal access to the venue's facilities. In another instance, he refused to perform at a New Orleans venue when the venue refused to allow an integrated audience. I'm sure he'd come to a boiling point. You can't always be cool and collected when you're faced with such hatred and mistreatment on a daily basis. He definitely had it way easier than most Black Americans in the 1930s, but it still wasn't always pleasant. Louis Armstrong was adamant that music could help break the racial barriers. So he kept playing, with dreams of equality coming through in every note. But outside of the United States, race didn't seem to be an issue. In fact, he was treated like royalty in Europe. The color of his skin didn't matter. He was a wonderful person and an extremely talented musical artist. That's who he was. And they embraced him and showered him with love and appreciation. Novel concept, huh? So he's a huge star. He's on the stage, he's on the radio, he's on records, and now it's time to be on the big screen. Louis Armstrong had to be on the silver screen. You can't let a charismatic energy and talent like that not be seen. His first feature film was with Bing Crosby in Pennies from Heaven in 1936. Man, I just love watching Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong together. They teamed up often, including one of my favorites, High Society, with Bing, Frank Sinatra, and the stunning Grace Kelly about 20 years down the road. He broke racial barriers in Hollywood films with his vibrant appearances and awesome musical performances. Louis's third marriage to Elpha Smith ended in 1942 after 4 years. But it was quickly time to walk down the aisle again. Wife number 4 was Lucille Wilson, who Louis married in October of 1942. And guess what? Lucille was there to stay. She was the one. Lucille was all in supporting her husband's dreams. She had a savvy business sense, and she recognized that cultivating a rich public image was almost as important as the music itself. Of course, Louis naturally had an electric charisma, but Lucille helped him hone in that perfect image that would be trademark Louis Armstrong, the cultural icon we all know and love. Louis and Lucille made a home in Queens, and their home was their safe haven, their private retreat from the world. Louis loved to cook and garden in his personal time at home, and he and Lucille were very active and supportive in their community. Louis would sit on the stoop of his home and chat with neighbors and play his trumpet for the neighborhood children. He'd also visit children's hospitals to play for the kids there. Oh, I just love that. What a wonderful man. You can see a virtual tour of Louis and Lucille's home on the Louis Armstrong House Museum website. You should really check it out. I'll link it. The kitchen, the bathrooms, and the primary bedroom closet are wild. Okay, this is where it gets really cool and really amazing. Starting in the 1940s, Louis Armstrong started recording his thoughts on reel-to-reel tapes. Every night he would do this, kind of like an audio diary, a day-to-day memoir. And these private thoughts didn't always match his bubbly, optimistic public persona. He was raw and real. This isn't to say his stage presence was fake. Nothing about him was fake. But there was just more to him. He had emotions other than happiness, just like the rest of us. Former Chicago Tribune jazz writer Howard Reich described the Louis Armstrong we hear on these tapes well. Quote, "A portrait of Armstrong that his closest friends and musician friends already had. That he's not this one-dimensional caricature. That he's not the smiling, get-happy entertainer. That he's also a real human being. He's as torn about race as the rest of the country is. And there's so much more than the kind of minstrel show facade that Armstrong self-consciously projected." End quote. Louis Armstrong recorded his thoughts almost every single day for nearly 30 years. Before he died, he asked that these intimate recordings be housed in the archives at Queens College, and they are taking very good care of them. Another boiling point came to the cool, down-to-earth Louis Armstrong in 1957 at something that was occurring in Little Rock, Arkansas. The events that took place in September of 1957 in Little Rock downright pissed Louis Armstrong off. He'd had it with racism, and he reacted in a way that could have easily ruined his career. But he didn't care. He had to stand up for his people. Here's what happened. After the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the NAACP worked to slowly integrate Black students into previously all-white schools. In September of 1957, 9 students were registered to begin the school year at Little Rock Central High. These students were known as the Little Rock Nine, and the NAACP had selected them specifically based on their excellent grades and attendance. They were good kids, and they deserved a good education, an equal education. Well, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus wanted to keep his racist people happy since he was up for another term. Desegregating schools during election time would be bad for his campaign. So he called in the Arkansas National Guard to, quote, preserve the peace. And what Governor Faubus meant by preserving the peace was not allowing those 9 Black teenagers into the white school because that would cause mayhem and rioting. To make it even more disgusting, when there wasn't actually any real imminent danger of the rioting, Governor Faubus allegedly called in his people to create a mob so his actions were justified. He fabricated a crisis at the cost of Black kids just trying to go to school. United States National Guard soldiers physically blocked Black students from entering school. That is ugly. One of the Little Rock Nine, Elizabeth Eckford, recalled of the National Guard blockade. Quote, "They moved closer and closer. Somebody started yelling. I tried to see a friendly face somewhere in the crowd, someone who could maybe help. I looked into the face of an old woman and it seemed like a kind face. But when I looked at her again, she spat on me." End quote. President Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped in and overrode Governor Faubus's control of the Arkansas National Guard so the 9 students could enter the school and attend classes. Not a moment too soon. He waited 3 weeks to do this. It was a brutally horrific year for the students who, while trying to learn, received daily verbal and physical abuse. And I'm not just talking white students hitting them or throwing things at them. I'm talking about things like Melba Patillo having acid thrown in her eyes, or the time a group of white girls trapped her in a bathroom stall and dropped flaming sheets of paper over the top of the door in an attempt to start Melba on fire. Another Black student, Minnie Jean Brown, was suspended and then expelled for trying to fight back to her white abusers. So after that brief history lesson on the Little Rock Nine, now I'll tell you how Louis Armstrong got involved in the situation. When he learned that the Arkansas National Guard was physically blocking the 9 students from entering Little Rock Central High, he was irate. The musician, known for his calm and happy demeanor, was not calm and happy when it came to the disgusting behavior at the hands of the government, especially to children. He spoke out by saying, quote, "The way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell," end quote. Louis Armstrong didn't speak publicly about racism often. He had very strong opinions and was highly educated on the happenings surrounding race relations around the country. But he knew his public voice was strong, and he chose to keep that voice quiet for the most part on the topic of racism. But the Little Rock Nine incident pushed him over the edge. These were children. Armstrong had a Soviet tour planned, but with the situation in Little Rock, he canceled the tour because that concert tour was sponsored by the State Department. He publicly chastised Governor Faubus, even publicly calling him a mother effer, and he called President Eisenhower two-faced and said he had no guts for allowing Governor Faubus to control the situation in Arkansas with national government interception, for allowing him to disregard the United States Constitution and promote segregation and racism for his own political needs, so he could win votes. Like I said, it was 3 weeks later after the incident and after Louis Armstrong spoke out, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to ensure the safe entrance of the 9 students into the high school. Many believe it was Louis Armstrong's public statement that pushed the president to intercede finally. In an interview with Louis Armstrong the day before the Little Rock 9 attempted to go to school, he was asked if he thought what was happening with things like the Little Rock incident were just growing pains of the United States. If he thought we would just grow out of it. Okay, I gotta say here, that interviewer must not know how much horror Black Americans had been going through every single day. Well, here was Louis Armstrong's reply. Quote, "I think we will because it's much better than it was 10 years ago, you know. But why do we have to suffer so much for people to realize that we're all right? You know what I mean? The government trusts everybody but the Spades. I mean, the colored people. I mean, I don't know why, but when you throw us in there, we throw our hearts into it and everything because we're just doing it for our country. And when we look around at this fellow that you trust, that's the one that will stick you in the back with a dagger." End quote. Louis Armstrong was often called an Uncle Tom by other African Americans. Uncle Tom is a name given to individuals who are seen as being obedient or subservient to white people, who push aside the realities of racism in order to please and be accepted into the white community. He was called this because of his life in a white-dominated entertainment world. What some saw was a smooth transition into a life of acceptance and ease. But many didn't realize the racial barriers Louis Armstrong had to fight through, and continued to fight through, to get to where he was. So it really upset him when other Black people called him an Uncle Tom. When asked about being called an Uncle Tom, Armstrong said, quote, "Some people, even some of my own people, have felt that I've been soft on the race issue. Some have even accused me of being an Uncle Tom, of not being aggressive. How can they say that? I've pioneered in breaking the color line in many southern states with mixed bands, Negro and white. I've taken a lot of abuse, put up with a lot of jazz, even been in some pretty dangerous spots through no fault of my own for almost 40 years, end quote. He went on to say, quote, "In that Little Rock statement, I didn't only mean Little Rock. I mean that there was a bad spirit going around. It wasn't safe for many Negroes to take a walk with their girlfriends without being beaten up. There was lots of that going around. People forget that we took up guns too, but we didn't backfire. The trouble is we're not trusted enough. One Negro does something and 50,000 have to suffer for it," end quote. He was chastised by many in the Black community for his harsh words against the government during the Little Rock 9 incident. Many thought he was making African Americans look bad. But his intentions were good. He was mad, rightfully so. He knew he had a public platform that could be heard, and he spoke what he felt in his soul. There had been great optimism with the amendment to the U.S. Constitution calling for the end of segregation in schools. It looked like a step in the right direction. Positive change was coming. But then he watches this very same government stand back and allow its military to prohibit that change from happening, allowing it to blatantly ignore the United States Constitution. Louis Armstrong remained proud of his reaction to the Little Rock incident for the rest of his life. Back to the music. Louis Armstrong continued to play and tour until he was in his late 60s. He loved what he did, and he loved providing the magic of music to his audiences and believed through his entire life that music was a crucial key in breaking racial barriers. Music was a universal language that could join everyone together, regardless of race. He traveled all over the world for decades, bringing people together and sharing his art. Louis Armstrong was also very philanthropic in his later years. He supported a wide range of organizations, but education and music were the ones closest to his heart. He was a huge supporter of youth music programs. He wanted to make sure as many kids as possible could grow up to change the world through music like he had. And he did most of his philanthropic work anonymously. He wasn't in it for the attention, he was in it for the cause. He had the financial means to help others, and he was more than happy to share his wealth in good ways. He and Lucille remained married, and they were very happy. She was his perfect fit, his partner in life. She traveled all over the world with him, and they made so many amazing memories together. By 1970, Louis Armstrong was forced to stop touring due to his ailing health. He had kidney issues and had suffered a heart attack, and it was time to slow down and focus on his body. He tried, but he just really wanted to keep playing his trumpet for people. He kept playing at home and had hopes to get back on the stage again. Sadly, his body had given all it could. Louis Armstrong died from cardiac arrest on July 6, 1971, at his home. He was 69 years old. Louis Armstrong's honorary pallbearers was a cast of legends: Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, Count Basie, Frank Sinatra, Ed Sullivan, Johnny Carson, and more. Louis Armstrong was posthumously awarded a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1972, and his recordings were inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1973. He was inducted into the Big Band and Jazz Hall of Fame in 1978 and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1990. Now, I would like to share some other interesting things I learned during my research. Bullet point number 1. Not surprisingly, but seriously something I never even considered, was that Louis Armstrong had a lifelong struggle with damage to his lips and mouth from his constant, aggressive trumpet playing. I mean, he really went to town on that thing. His lips were always calloused, and he had to use tons of different salves to keep up with the healing. He would even cut off calluses and scar tissue from his own lips with a razor blade. Ouch. His lips were pretty damaged by the time of his death. Bullet point number 2. Louis Armstrong was a strong advocate for the use of laxatives. It was his preferred weight control method. He was so passionate about the use of laxatives for weight loss that he published a diet plan called Lose Weight the Satchmo Way. And he passed this out with a photo of him on the toilet to friends and people on the street. I did find that picture, so I will post it on my social media. All jokes aside, though, what was really going on was he had an eating disorder. According to the Louis Armstrong House Museum, this stemmed from his childhood when his mother was too poor to buy food for her children, so she would rummage through garbages and feed Louis and his sister food that was often old and moldy. To ensure they wouldn't get sick, she would then make them take a natural laxative to flush out any toxic bacteria from the food. Unfortunately, she didn't realize that she was setting the early groundwork for her child to have a lifelong struggle with his body image. Bullet point number 3. Louis Armstrong loved to smoke weed. He described marijuana as, quote, 1,000 times better than whiskey. I don't know about that. Bullet point number 4. My husband and I had Louis Armstrong's song, What a Wonderful World, played as one of our first dance songs at our wedding in 2004. I've just always loved him, and he was there with me on the most important day of my life. In conclusion, Louis Armstrong lived such a remarkable life and brought so much joy and happiness to so many people all over the world. He was born into poverty and hardship and very easily could have lived that way for his entire life. But once that first cornet was placed into his hands and he discovered the outlet it provided for him, his fate was set into place. He was an inspiration to other aspiring Black entertainers. He showed that, yes, it will not be easy, but they could make it too. Through hard work, a positive outlook, and optimism about a brighter, more equal future, they could achieve what he had. And with each new Black entertainer who busted through those ugly racial barriers like he had, it would be a little bit easier for the next, and then the next, and then the next. Our country has a very ugly past of racial inequality and racism-fueled hatred and violence. Artists like Louis Armstrong had to fight through that ugliness to get to where he was going. To do what he loved and to share his positivity and love of music with others, he had to overcome obstacles every step of the way. But he somehow did it with a smile on his face and a positive mindset. Well, most of the time. Louis Armstrong didn't just read the music and play the notes. He learned how to improvise and add his own unique personality to his music. He gave out so much emotion. His trumpet was an extension of his soul, and he shared a part of his soul with every single person who had the honor of hearing him play. His legendary friend Bing Crosby once said of him, "He is the beginning and the end of music in America." Thank you, Louis Armstrong, for putting up with harsh racism and unfairness and still being such an inspiration of positivity, strength, and happiness. Your smile lights up a room even when you're just on a television screen. I can't imagine what it must have been like to be in your actual physical presence. They sure don't make them like you every day. Thank you for being so awesome. And thank you all for listening. If you like what you hear on the show, I would really appreciate it if you could take a couple seconds and give a 5-star rating where you listen to your podcasts. And if possible, a positive review would make me so happy. It really helps get new listeners to the show. Thank you so much to those who have already done this. I have some really great bonus content available on Patreon, so if you are interested in receiving bonus episodes and being a part of the Movie of the Month Club, head on over to patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast to sign up. For $4 a month, you get to be part of the Movie of the Month Club, my Movie of the Month recap episode each month, access to our Discord chat rooms, which I'll admit are a ghost town, but once we get a good community up and running, I know it'll be lots of fun, and I'll send you a nice Stars of the Golden Age sticker. And if you want all of that plus access to those full-length bonus episodes, you can join the Oscar tier for $8 a month. And that gets you access to all of the bonus content I already mentioned, plus a full-length bonus episode. So you get access to everything that's already on Patreon, plus everything going forward as long as you want to stick around. This month's bonus episode is Black History in Hollywood. And our movie of the month this month is Imitation of Life, starring the great Claudette Colbert and the great Louise Beavers. So, patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast is where you'll find all of the info about accessing that sweet bonus content. I know some people like to just support their favorite content creators and don't want bonus content in return. So if you fit that category, there is an option that you can just give a little support out of the kindness of your heart. You can support the show at buymeacoffee.com/goldenage. Buy Me a Coffee, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is a fun little idea for supporting creators. It gives you an easy way to donate to Buy a Coffee for $3 or 3 coffees for $9 and so on. Just a cute little visual idea for support. Showing consumers that supporting your favorite creators can cost you as little as a cup of coffee. Anyways, you can access that at buymeacoffee.com/goldenage. I appreciate you all so much. It really means a lot to me that you take the time to listen to my little show when there is a sea of millions of shows out there to choose from. I'll give you stories as long as you want to listen. For this episode, I used a book titled Louis Armstrong, The Untold Story of Jazz's Beloved Ambassador by Celine Ashcroft. I also used information from the Louis Armstrong House virtual exhibits, an episode of ABC's Nightline called Satchmo's Blues, and of course, my own ambassador of jazz, IMDB.